Hello, everyone, and welcome. Uh, Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to give it a couple more minutes just to provide some time for people to join. Um, Again, we have a very interesting session ahead of us. I'm joined by some longtime collaborators at Finboot as well, who will provide their insights as we go through some of the digital innovations in oil and gas, in chemicals, and in the plastic industry, and how these innovations are helping organizations in their transition to a circular economy. Now, before we begin with some introductions, I just want to remind everyone that you are up for a prize today. So we will be raffling a copy of Geoffrey's latest book, Carbon, Capital, and the Cloud, a playbook for digital oil and gas. Now, in order to enter the raffle, you must be signed up through the StreamYard registration form. So I know some of you might be joining from YouTube or from LinkedIn directly. So if you're interested in getting a copy, you'll see there's a registration link there where you can leave your details. And at the end of today's session, we will be doing the raffle, right? So without a further ado or further delay, let's get started. Let's jump in. My name is Juan. I am the CEO and one of the founders at Finboot. I will be the host. Sorry, for today's session. Very quick kind of debrief on Finboot. We are a technology company that focuses on delivering digital traceability solutions to customers in capital intensive and difficult to decarbonize industries, such as the ones that we're going to be chatting about today. Now, as I said, today with me, we've got two longtime collaborators of Finboot. We've got Geoffrey Cann, an expert in all things oil and gas, and we have John Fletcher, who's a Chief Sustainability Officer with a strong background in digital. So if you don't mind, gentlemen, I'll let you introduce yourselves and provide a bit more detail. Geoffrey?
Thank you so much, Juan. My name is Geoffrey Cann, and I'm an international author and speaker on digital innovation in energy. My first book is entitled Bits, Bytes, and Barrels, and it was published in 2019. And it sets out the business case for the adoption of digital in the oil and gas industry. My second book is entitled Machine Learning and Data Science in the Oil and Gas Industry, and it was published in 2021. It's a collaboration with some engineers from Samsung who specialize in this area. And as Juan has mentioned, my latest book, Carbon, Capital, and the Cloud, was released in 2022. And it provides 9 case studies of successful adoption of digital in energy. And if you want to stalk me on social media, you can track me down here at these details. Thanks. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'm John Fletcher. I have about 30 years of combined experience in the automotive supply chain, apparel, luxury good, and fashion, and particularly in nonwoven manufacturing, obviously using plastic raw materials, and most recently in specialty chemicals with 15 years experience in that sector, and primarily combined of innovation, digitalization, and especially on the broad topic of carbon management and ESG reporting. So very, very pleased to be able to be here with all of you today, and especially as Juan Miguel said, great opportunity to discuss these topics. And certainly I have my own experience with Finboot, which has really been fantastic. Juan Miguel?
Thank you. No, and again, thank you both once more for agreeing to take part of today's session, right? So the way the session, let's say, or the webinar is going to work today is we're going to start with a brief keynote speech from Geoffrey, who's going to kind of set the scene around the main themes that we're going to be discussing. After that, we'll jump into a bit of a panel conversation between the three of us. We've got some questions prepared for that panel, but I do encourage you to post your own questions, your own insights. You've got the comment section to do that. And we intend and we hope to essentially go through as many of those as we possibly can. So feel free to start sending some of those questions at any time. So from the moment Geoffrey starts his keynote, and we'll start queuing them up and accumulating them, and we'll cover those in the panel section. So Geoffrey, over to you for the keynote.
Thank you again. My first exposure to the circular economy did not inspire a lot of confidence. Back in the 1970s, we were clearly poor. And with 6 kids in our household, there simply wasn't enough money at times to buy new clothes. This is the most hideous family photo we ever took. In fact, it's turned the other way around in my mom's house, so you can't see it. All the kids here, including me, were all wearing secondhand clothes that have been recycled in some fashion. So necessity, or in my situation, a mild case of poverty, teaches you to value your stuff, make your stuff last longer, use your stuff minimally so that you reduce wear and tear, and then to repurpose your stuff at the end of its life. And these are, in fact, the rules of the circular economy. Now, the hydrocarbon industry, on the other hand, has never been particularly hip with circular thinking. In fact, the business model for the industry is linear. Just watch this little video below to show you. The producer extracts the resource, crude oil, raw gas, or dirty coal, and then transforms it into something useful, like a fuel or energy products or a petrochemical product. The midstream industry then moves these useful products from manufacturing and blending, and then ships them to every corner of the planet. And then us, the consumer, we use it. We burn it, we wear it, we build with it, and lots of other uses. And then eventually we dispose of it. That could be as a carbon emission into the atmosphere, construction materials which end up in landfills, or single-use plastics everywhere. It's all waste. And if you look at this little chart below, you'll see there's no evidence of a circle. Now, regulators have imposed tons of compliance requirements on the industry to deal with waste. But a true circular thinking, where a molecule starts at one end of the value chain, works its way all the way through to its final conclusion somewhere, besides a landfill or as an emission or as garbage on the side of the road, that hasn't really fully penetrated the sector. Here are just some of the reasons why not. The producers, they're participating in global commodity markets, and they have every incentive to water down or oppose changes to the industry if those changes are not universally adopted. Otherwise, those who adopt the change will find themselves at an economic disadvantage relative to their global competitors who have been less adaptive to this change. Second, there hasn't been a consensus on a market mechanism or a price to stimulate the right behavior more universally. Us consumers, we prefer virgin material. And we haven't had the capacity or the capability to cope with the enormous data volumes required to track relatively small aggregations of molecules, like what you find in a plastic bottle. And without that data, it's very hard to take meaningful action to close the circle. And so the industry has plodded along, slowly hazarding a change here, testing something out there. But now, the energy industry is being called upon to embrace the circular economy now, and with some very good reasons. The first and principal one, as you all know, is climate change. It's forcing a reckoning with this unsustainable linear model of extract, transform, consume, and then dispose. The burden to adopt circular practices is becoming far more global now. And this is having the effect of leveling the playing field, finally. And of course, society now demands more transparency about industry and how our personal choices impact the environment. And the ability to avoid detection and waste is no longer such a good strategy. Regulators in major gilt-edged markets, such as the EU, are starting to impose new rules on industry that demand greater attention. There are now real penalties should a brand declare that its products meet global sustainability standards, or its fuel is green, but then be unable to approve it. All of the process industries now have some real tangible examples of the circular economy at work. As you know, I specialize in the oil and gas industry. Let me just share with you some of the leading examples that I watch very carefully. First and foremost is carbon capture and storage. CCS is my favorite example for emissions. CO2 is captured at the flue stack of a natural gas-fired power turbine, particularly one that's using very clean methane. This is very, very pure and it's free of contaminants. Separating the carbon from the oxygen yields a very pure form of carbon, which is ideal for many applications. Or, as often happens, the CO2 is captured and then simply injected back underground where it is stored. Next is plastics recycling. Another groundbreaking effort comes from the petrochemical giant SABIC. Through an initiative called TrueCircle, SABIC aims to design products for recyclability, implement mechanical recycling programs, and then certify specific products as being circular. As one example, SABIC is tracking plastics inputs from a company called Plastic Energy's recycling process as they flow through SABIC's polymers unit at the factories, and the delivery of the polymers to another company, Intraplas, who then convert them into a packaging solution, shown here. It's a little yogurt tub. Marco from Finboot ensures that all of the data gathered through this whole circle are immutable, while at the same time shared for suppliers, customers, and regulators. A third example is drilling waste recovery. Drilling muds that are used to lubricate the drill bit when you're drilling for oil and gas, and then bring all those drilling cuttings up the wellbore. If you think about it, they're all contaminated with oil and chemicals. Now, the normal practice in our industry is that you send this waste stream off untreated to landfills. However, these muds contain very valuable compounds. A company called Recover Energy provides industrial scale recycling of this waste stream by removing all these chemicals and oils for reuse, and then sends a dramatically cleaner drilling, cutting, and mud remnant flow to disposal. Now, fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, one of the barriers is data handling and data, all the data, the volumes that are required here. The technologies that we need to embark on circular models in oil and gas are no longer really science fiction, but they're now proven and they're in use and they're advancing all the time. In fact, we interact with these innovations so regularly now, they're no longer even viewed as all that innovative. Here's just 3 simple samples, and there's plenty more. First is cloud computing. Cloud, turns out, is the only practical way to build business solutions to do things like track these products and compounds across services and industries and companies. And this is, they're absolutely required to be able to fit together and piece together how this will work across the oil and gas ecosystem. Next is blockchain. It's the only known database structure that's widely available, commercially free, and trusted. And of course, artificial intelligence. It's now the only practical way we have for crunching all of this data at speed, at scale, uniformly, and tailored for every individual company, organization, and unit in the supply chain. And of course, IoT sensors. We need these to go and capture data where you can't take your phone, such as deep underwater, inside a fuel tank, down inside an oil well, high in the air at a flue stack, or maybe at some remote site that's simply too costly to visit. There are many, many other technologies that can play a role here. As it turns out, these building blocks, they're not the hard part. It's the mindset shift that is the heavy lift. So let me wrap up with these points. Anyone can claim that their products are the outcome of a circular model, or they're organic, or they're green, or they're not from some sanctioned state. But can you prove it? And so here's the question. How will oil and gas, petrochemicals, process industries of all kinds be able to prove that their products are meeting these emerging global standards for sustainability? Now let's turn to the panel discussion, and Juan, over to you for the next stages here.
Thanks, Geoffrey, and an excellent presentation and interesting points as usual. Right, I think particularly again my big takeaway is the fact that the shift of mindset is perhaps the biggest barrier that we have. The technologies there, the digital innovations exist.
Yeah,
it's just finding a way in which we can accelerate and facilitate the implementation of those building blocks, of those puzzle pieces. That's what's going to make it a truly kind of game changer, right? So yeah, as I said, look, we'll jump into a bit of a conversation now. I'll be asking you guys a few questions just to get your insights again in that theme of circular economy as applied to the industries where you have the most experience. Re-emphasize to our audience that please you can start sharing some of your questions in the comments box, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. But yeah, let me start, John, with you. You've held leadership roles in the chemical industry, in the automotive industry, in retail and apparel, right? So in your experience, how are these industrial segments looking at the circular economy? What are they doing around that? What are some of the main initiatives, let's say, that are moving the needle for these industry segments?
Thank you, Juan Miguel. I think it would probably best to separate some of the large industry segments if we were to block transportation together, airline companies, the automotive companies, and then maybe compare and contrast that with apparel, footwear, accessories, and here, you know, all the large brands that we're so familiar with clothing, for example. They're very interesting to look at both of these segments because they have quite vast differences. But in thinking about it, I think it will be a very good example. So if we were to start with fashion and apparel as a broad sector, and you break it down to a very fundamental element, the advantage that they have is that they have a wide-ranging use of what we could call homogeneous materials, Juan Miguel. That would mean the article that you're buying is primarily a kind of a plastic, or maybe leather, or maybe some other type of fundamental raw material. Think about a typical cotton shirt that has been in the market for as long as we've all been alive. This type of material flow has many advantages in that you're not using many types of raw materials in combination in either a very complex device, such as the cars that we drive. And if you think about it that way, a huge company, it doesn't matter if we compare Inditex with General Motors, let's assume for the moment they're more or less the same size operation, fundamentally different outlook on circularity because of how attainable it is to contextualize circularity for a typical fashion article than it is for a very complex platform such as a car. So from that point of view, I would say that any types of industries where you have where the end article, if we want to use that language, is more or less homogeneous materials, you have much more pressure on the need for circularity and much more understanding of how to do it, regardless of differences in geography, law, or regulations. These types of homogeneous types of materials have a much higher uptake or take rate on the concept of circularity than if you're talking about how can you make an aircraft 100% end of life circular? How can you make a vehicle 100% end of life circular? And from that point of view, maybe one of the forward questions would be, well, what's going to happen to those complex composite material, heterogeneous materials, where you have many different types of raw materials coming together to create those platforms? Ultimately, those brands, and particularly those sectors, are going to have to think about redesign. There was, in the pursuit of performance for basically the last 50 years, the design mechanism was, how can we use all of these highly specialized raw materials in combination to create a superior performance and superior quality platform? Again, such as a highly complex car. If you think about end of life, one of the main challenges with those sectors is, very simply, how can you reclaim the seat of the car and break that down, all the engine components, plastics here and other types of raw materials there. We simply don't have this complex infrastructure to do that yet. Nonetheless, that industry is going to have to think about design increasingly to move in the direction that at end of life of those highly complex platforms, how is the infrastructure ultimately going to be able to access those precious raw materials and get that into a circular flow? And just putting a circle around that again, if you come back to the things that are more homogeneous, the good examples are the plastic bottle, the cotton t-shirt. I think those are going to be in the near term where we're going to see the most progress.
Yeah, no. And it makes sense, right? The more complex the asset, the more difficult it will be to turn it or to transition it into a circular or a fully circular model. But I guess the way of looking at this, it shouldn't be seen as a barrier, but rather, well, where can we start, right? So aircraft manufacturers or automotive manufacturers, they should be thinking about, okay, look, should we look at our steel, right? And that becomes a more homogeneous material. Can we look at how scrap is being inserted? And you already start kind of rolling the ball with some type of circular model there, right? But certainly I fully understand and agree with your point, right? So now, when it comes to the chemical industry in particular, right? Because the chemical industry, while some of those products may be fairly homogeneous, the challenge that it has is the vast variety of products that it has, right? So companies have huge portfolios of many different similar and yet vastly different products, right? So how do you see, or which ones do you think are kind of like the biggest goals that the chemical industry has ahead in terms of the circular economy? And what are the business outcomes that are linked to those goals, right? Because it's always good to see, okay, this is a challenge with circular economy, but also it makes sense to us. It makes sense to us because financially we will benefit in this and this way.
Indeed, Juan Miguel, it's a very good leading question, and I think I'd like to build off what Geoffrey already presented, which was really the foundation of the petrochemical industry, going through cracking and various distillation phases, because that ultimately is going to drive all the downstream, let's say mid-complicated or ultimately in the spec chem and especially chemical field, is what happens, what are the possibilities upstream. But as you mentioned, as you move from the commodity petrochemical field of play, where you may be talking about 10 or 20 different fractionalized chemicals, you start moving downstream, and you're then moving into that area of highly specialized chemistries, which ultimately are accessing hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of molecular compositions as to raw materials. So without trying to make it too complicated, I'll give you an idea of where I think specialty chemical is moving to. Is first of all to focus on the entire upstream side, and the reason for that is that there are more opportunities today to make an impact on, as Geoffrey mentioned, accessing either carbon neutral or carbon positive technologies upstream that could be based on more renewable petrochemical alternatives, carbon capture, as Geoffrey mentioned, or even some of the biochemical alternatives that are available. Those are things that the spec chem industry can do today. And I think it was mentioned earlier by Geoffrey, for example. Measuring it is one part of the story. There's a vast field now of life cycle assessments. That's one of the foundational applications used to do that. But most importantly, what Geoffrey mentioned is, how are you going to prove that? That's where some of the tech platforms out there, such as mass balance, recycling, being able to not only access that type of technology coming from the petrochemical manufacturers, but ultimately being able to trace the transaction through the supply chain, so you can document that evidence to the satisfaction of the auditing community. And although that sounds like a big financial discussion, that's where all of the sustainability and ESG valuations now, particularly on the large sectors and the large publicly traded or private equity managed companies, are coming into play. And what I'm trying to say is, where 5 years ago ESG reporting would be considered the minimum requirements for very large operations, now, particularly with the passing of the CSRD law in Europe, you're finding out that auditing companies are moving into these large companies and saying, we need more than your annual ESG report. You have to show us some sort of traceability of either these more positive climate management supply chain that you're setting up, that you say you're setting up. You have to prove that. And that's where I think the Marco technology and blockchain can really come into play to trace that throughout the supply chain. And I didn't want to leave off my response with very little or very lightly on the circularity question. But when you're in the middle of that supply chain, most of those companies in spec chem today, at least for the next 1 or 2 years, are going to be focusing on the upstream documentation and transactional documentation, because the responsibility for the middle of the supply stream, if they are supplying into a highly complex platform, again, like automotive or aircraft, basically the ability for them to control the circularity, if their materials are being combined with a wide range of other types of raw materials, is a very complex thing to address. But as you said, this is something that that this industry has to start to communicate on more widely. But being able to trace the transactional value with technology is going to be a requirement from the auditing community, and I would want to stress that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, as audit and transparency and more, let's say, evidence-backed claims become the norm, data quality and the data input, it becomes critical, right? And as you say, that's where some of the digital innovations will play a big role. Geoffrey, we've got a couple of comments here from Umar Ahmed in the audience, right? So the first one was a little bit about how, if I understand correctly here, how in simple terms, the connection is between oil and gas, chemical and plastics when it comes to the circular economy. And then he mentions a specific experience here you may or may not be familiar with, but I'll ask you to provide some insights into that, of the use of an expired catalyst in refining that can be used an expired catalyst from the chemical industry that can be used to refine crude oil. So if you can address, Geoffrey, some of these comments, again, to the level that you're aware of them.
Yeah, well, let me turn to the this question of the supply chain. I'll go back to that little picture I put up on the screen during my brief remarks. Yeah. The problem with this industry, let me just go back here. The problem with this industry, this is our supply chain. Every single one of these little, I grab my mouse here. I don't know if I can see it. You can see my mouse, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Every one of these yellow lines represents a custodial transfer of control of a hydrocarbon from one party to another. And every one of these little nodes, these little junction points, in oil and gas terms, is viewed as a market. That's a market where buyers and sellers aggregate to transact and negotiate that custodial transfer of control of a hydrocarbon product. And coming out of the oil refining complex, which is very much at the front end here, the oil refining complex, we think of it as producing, aviation fuel, diesel fuel, whatnot. There's 4,000 compounds can come out of your standard oil refinery, waxes and lubricants and fuels and all sorts of products. So the tracking and moving, and so we come out to the very end here where we have a consumer, like a petrochemical company, who's buying some of these finished products out of the refining complex and then is using them to make a plastic product. You somehow have to figure out, how do I show the custodial transfer of control of those molecules through that entire chain? And by the way, they've been blended all the way through, and they're traded constantly. It is a well understood in the industry that from just in this point here, where the oil is produced out of a pump and before it's sent to the refinery, that line there, that single line, oil products, crude oil products, are traded 9 times on average before they actually get to the oil refinery. So when you start to think about this in the complexity of this industry, you really start to grasp just precisely how challenging it is to answer quite simple question. Where do these molecules come from, and were they produced sustainably? Did they come from a sanctioned state or not? To the question about where the compounds flow from, after you crack the compounds out of oil and gas to create the basic building blocks for petrochemicals, that's all down in here. And then they move into the market. So it's only a segment of the petroleum industry's product flow ultimately gets into the petrochemicals industry. 25% of an oil refinery on average goes into the fuels sector as just one instance, as just one piece of breakdown. So that helps you kind of grasp the kind of the structure of this industry and why this is such a challenge. You just remind me again, Juan Miguel, what was the second question?
So the second comment was around the use of an expired catalyst in chemical for refining crude oil.
Yeah. So that expired catalyst is going to pop up out of here, out of the oil refinery. And if it were used in other parts of the industry, I think that's an excellent example of a circular economy thinking. I don't personally know of any examples of that, but if that's possible, then that's a very, very good use of circular thinking in this industry.
Yeah, and I think, look, one of the kind of underlying elements is this map gives us an idea of how the loop is not just going from plastic waste again to plastic, right? So actually we can have, let's say, more innovative ways to design our products in which the waste of one industry or one market can become the raw material to another one, right? And we're already seeing that. So a lot of the fuels, biofuels or sustainable aviation fuel, as an example, all of these are using waste from different industries, agriculture, even urban waste, urban organic waste, right? And they're pumping that into these oil and gas complexes just to produce lower emissions or low emission fuels, right? So I think what we need as we move to a kind of more global and broader view of a circular model is that it's not a small picture type of thing. It needs to be something a lot bigger and more interconnected, right? It's just taking that map and then just turning it into a circle. That's already like a complex enough.
That's a really, really big problem. And when you think about energy transition and decarbonization of our economies, our goal of parts of society is to start diversifying our energy mix away from this supply chain to others. The consequence of this is that some of this infrastructure in here, some of this infrastructure is going to be surplus to need. And so a big part of oil and gas when it comes to the circular economy is going to be around capturing some of this infrastructure and turning it back into some other usable social part of the economy. Part of that's just recovering steel. But in oil and gas, Yeah, there are millions of oil wells. They need to be capped. They need to be abandoned, the infrastructure removed, and then the land returned back to its original use. Otherwise, we're left with this infrastructure forever. That doesn't make any sense. So a big part of this industry, as it caps and starts to manage its size, is to deal with the fact that we've got too much infrastructure for our purposes.
And I think this is I'll take this as a good segue into my last two questions, let's say, that I wanna place, and I wanna hear from the both of you in each of them, and it all goes around alignment, right? So as you say, Geoffrey, there's a lot that needs to be done, right? There's a lot of challenges ahead, and I wanna kind of see your insights, and I'll pose both questions and then let you each kind of intervene and answer them. The first one is around the driving forces in terms of groups, in a way. So we've got the regulator, and there's a lot of regulatory initiatives around that are moving towards a more circular model, or kind of putting more pressure around the sustainable activities of companies, right? That's one group. Then you've got capital markets, where the investment thesis of a lot of big, let's say, or deep pockets in the industry are shifting and are saying, we need to see an ESG strategy. We need to see verifiable claims. Greenwashing, it becomes an issue in our investments, right? So there's a lot of movements as well in the capital markets. And then there's a consumer and a social change of behavior, right? So in your view, these three groups, will they or are they aligned today, or how can we align them or help to better align them? And then the other one is just introducing yet another variable into that mix, which is the geographical one, right? So you've got those three groups, but at the same time, we're a big planet, right? What are the difference between what's going on in North America, what's going on in Europe, and what's going on in China, for instance, right? So in terms of geographics and then the different groups that are acting as driving forces for this change, what are your views in the alignment on those? So John, maybe I'll let you go first.
Thanks, Juan Miguel. That's an excellent question, and I can tell you from recent experience, there's a lot of material that we can pull from to help put some context on this. And it's quite good to also mention geography, because that cannot be underestimated. Where I think you have the most alignment, though, now, and I would say it's primarily because of the power of social media, is at the consumer level. So a typical consumer, doesn't matter, China, Philippines, Brazil, or in New York, I think they're having an increasingly aligned view of the world, of climate impact, and in this area, that's one of the levers, or one of the components of strong demand on a brand. And I mentioned brands. I think also the consumer, when you are manifesting the wishes of the consumer, these are also citizens, so they place a demand on government. But what I think is interesting is if I say there's alignment with consumers around the world, why is there not yet alignment with the legislative or the regulatory components from the various big blocks? And that's a rhetorical comment that I make, but it's a very good discussion point. Having said all that, I would come back then to what you mentioned on regulatory. It's very, very clear that there are vast differences in the regulatory speed or in the scope of regulatory, and it's certainly led by the EU. And just to very, very quickly mention some things for the viewers to take notice of, there's been tremendous legislative and regulatory steps in the past 18 months. Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the so-called CSRD, is implemented. The data collection is for 2023. The first full year of reporting is next year. That's happening right now. You all are aware of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. They've expanded the scope, moving beyond just climate management from a temperature point of view. meaning global warming, to now talk about science-based targets for nature, freshwater, biodiversity, land and ocean. You mentioned earlier, Juan Miguel, we now have a Green Claims Directive. That's the so-called anti-greenwashing bill passed by European Parliament. EU has also passed recently, just in the last 2 months, a deforestation law and something called the nature restoration law. So we're not going to take the time today to dive into all those, but certainly you see that there is just a wave of regulatory activity backed by European Parliament, where you do not yet see that, for example, in North America. And what you see in China is a little bit more focusing on water quality and pollution. To put that in perspective, that was something that the Americans did back in the 80s when they had the big pollution disaster. And I think that's kind of a parallel for what you see happening with China today. And very briefly, to summarize this, I think there's another demand side that's a little bit in the background. I mentioned it earlier, and here it's not the consumer, but it is at the stakeholder level. It is either the highest level shareholders at the large global publicly traded companies, or the largest private equity companies that may be the ownership component in a privately held enterprise. Why I mentioned that is now, in addition to the P&L, or the profit and loss statement, being the sole indicator of the enterprise value, you now are having the entire world of ESG. And here, of course, you have to quantify that, and that would be an entirely different session. But what I'm getting at, to put a summary on this point, I would say that for the largest corporations in the world, the demand and the importance of what the consumer is willing to put their value on circularity and on ESG, for example, is now being equaled by the stakeholder shareholder value. That putting it a very clean summary on this. If you're a large company today and you do not have a roadmap for climate management and circularity, and here I'm talking about a 10 or 15-year roadmap, your company can be devalued. So if company A has that roadmap, they will command a premium in the marketplace. If company B has nothing, they will be discounted. And that means that it's not only the consumer, but it's the enterprise value being driven by having these plans put together. And whether it's purely on climate management or going more broadly into circularity, that cannot be underestimated. And that would be my own summary. I'm happy to have Geoffrey's viewpoint on that.
Excellent, thanks. Yes, Geoffrey, over to you to see your point.
Yeah, I've always maintained, John, in my research and my books, that enterprise value is at risk for those organizations that are drifting behind. But there's an interesting dimension of the energy, which I think kind of illustrates why there's a significant gap between different markets. The energy consumption of the OECD nations, so that's most of Europe as well as Japan and Korea, Canada, the United States, Mexico. The OECD group of nations consumes the same amount of energy as Asia Pac, that which includes China and India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and other Philippines, other populous nations. Same amount of energy, but on a per capita basis, Asia Pac is just 1/3 of the energy consumption of the OECD. As Africa is 10% of the OECD. So you have to put yourself into the position of a leader, a politically elected leader, or in many cases, maybe not politically elected in some of these nations. And here you are, your people are, they're able to travel. They can see the energy availability to them versus what's available to other people around the world. That's a striking gap, 1/3. 1/3. So Asian nations are not going to stand by and not let their people have access to the same energy prosperity that's driven the success of the OECD economies. And so I believe that what we will continue to see, despite pressures for circularity and cleanliness and air and the like, is these Asia Pac, Africa will continue to ramp up their energy consumption so that they get close to OECD quality of life standards for health outcomes and food, nutrition, birth rates, all kinds of positivity that comes from high energy consuming nations. They're going to strive for the same thing. And if they have to sacrifice something in order to get there, it might be aspects of circularity, which we're thinking about here. Just as an example, when Europe said to Russia, we're no longer going to buy your natural gas, that's just 4% of the global gas supply was cut off, because that's all Russia counted for globally. Yet the price of gas went from $8 to $80. Vietnam, China, India, all went right back to burning coal and launching new coal-fired power plants.
Yeah, Geoffrey, that's a very interesting point, and it reminded me, I was really shocked. I was watching the DiCaprio video, and I just looked it up. It was called Before the Flood. The one thing that jumped out, and the only thing I remembered from that documentary, Geoffrey, was he went to India. DiCaprio went to India and was sitting down with, I don't know, let's call it the Minister of Energy. And she said, and of course, he was bringing the big claim that you, India, you have to clean up and you have to do all these great things that we're trying to do in Europe and the United States. And the minister immediately came back and said, thank you for coming, Mr. DiCaprio, but we have 50% of our population that don't have access to electricity at all. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to worry about bringing basic health and safety to our population first, before we worry about trying to make 100% clean energy. And it's not to be critical of anything. It's just to put some perspective on not all countries are in the same position to be able to address this complex problem. So I think having you mention that was very, very interesting. And I think another example of geography, Juan Miguel, getting back into chemical recycling, just accessing post-consumer or post-industrial waste plastic, without getting into the challenges of sorting, that whole topic itself. You have legislation in the EU which classifies incineration of plastics as a renewable energy, where I believe, Geoffrey, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think in several other parts of the world, particularly here in the West, it's not considered as renewable energy. So you have these differences around the world as well. Just on talking about the waste and post-consumer, post-industrial plastics we have today, that also have a bearing on how much a particular region or governments are going to invest in the infrastructure to access and reclaim these in fast pyrolysis or whatever the technologies may be, to get those reclaimed and recycled plastics back into the raw material stream. So I've thought those 2 points, Geoffrey, would be interesting.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think, look, part of these geographical differences, I think we also need to take it, living in OECD countries, we need to take it as a responsible view as well, of to say, well, where does responsibility lie, right? We perhaps should be the ones taking the lead in those in that transition and in those decarbonization, as we are, let's say, the responsible ones for most of that consumption. Now, we are coming up to the end of our session. I don't want to go without addressing one last question that came from the audience. So if you could do that, Geoffrey, very briefly, and then we'll go into closing. There's a question about in addition to the mental shift that is, of course, needed, what are some of those biggest challenges when it comes to data capture and data maintenance?
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about this as a system problem. So it's quite systemic, but there's all kinds of little challenges that get in the way. And I work in oil and gas, so let me just share a couple of examples. The oil and gas industry in the upstream part, where we actually look for crude oil and gas and natural gas, and we produce it, we organize in big oil companies by technical discipline. And right away, that impedes data sharing, because the group that's working together in their discipline is not incented really to collaborate with their peers in terms of data sharing and data collaboration. In fact, if you're in two different resource teams in a single oil and gas company, you're actually in a kind of quasi-competition to get access to scarce capital to develop the resource that you're responsible for. Do you drill here or do you drill there? Well, some committee somewhere is going to make that decision. So the last thing you're going to do when you think about it is help the guy on the other side of the aisle improve their prospects for getting their resource developed over your own. So right away, how you organize. Performance metrics, another good one. There are 3 basic performance metrics in the energy industry: safety, keep it safe; reliability, produce what you said you're going to produce; and cost. Hit the cost target because it's a global commodity. Nowhere in those performance metrics does it say clearly manage data and share data and use data to cooperate and collaborate with others. And in fact, any professional can make an argument that says better data management is not part of my responsibility set. You want me to be measured on those 3 measures? Don't talk to me about data sharing. That looks like a distraction. So, performance measures get in the way. And then the third thing that gets in the way is the technology we use. We buy products from different suppliers to do different jobs and manage that data. And then those products are often not built on open standards. And in fact, the technology companies themselves have their own incentive, when you think about it, to not necessarily collaborate with others, but to build a walled garden to keep you within their technology platform. And so they create barriers to even do data sharing. So there's all kinds of these little systemic problems you kind of got to work through if you want to do even some of this basic stuff, like share information across boundaries.
I know. I understand, John. In your view, in terms of data, again, data capture, data maintenance, what are some of those challenges?
Yeah, very quickly, I wanna come back to Vince's question, and I have some recent practical experience on this from the enterprise point of view. Most enterprises, even today, regardless of size, are operating in very much of kind of a silo mentality, and what that means, coming back on what Geoffrey mentioned, it's not the basic mentality to have a completely open type of environment, both on the supply side and on the demand side, or the customer or the supplier side. Another example of that is, no matter what the sophistication level is of the ERP that they may be using in that operation, there's still a very paper-based mentality, if I can use that kind of language, even back to the old days. Even now, even in large companies, you still might have purchase orders being faxed, purchase orders being scanned and emailed, or the actual supply order coming in from your supplier. So although that may be working in the old model, when you come back to what we've mentioned already several times today about documenting the transaction, the more complex your supply chain becomes, the more difficult it also is to use this current or older mentality that we're still doing today, the non-collaborative, non-open environment. So having said that, kind of coming back into where technologies like blockchain and the Marco product come into play, is that really opens the doors where the transactional evidence is automatically happening in the background. Without people having to look for an email or try to find some PDF file and move it over into a directory for the evidence that ultimately the auditors are going to need. And I wanted to mention that because that's where I really believe blockchain and digital technologies have the ability to kind of break and reset that mentality.
No, thank you. Now, okay, we'll take our very last question. Things got more interesting, but on the one side, feel free to reach out if you have more questions, and we'll take those offline. But for large companies that have a 10 to 15 year roadmap to decarbonization, what are some good initial projects that they can get to prove that roadmap? John?
Thanks, Juan Miguel. Let me take the first pass at this, because here again we've had some recent experience on this very broad topic, and I won't go into the amount of time to spend on renewable types of raw materials or focusing on circularity, because ultimately these are all connected. Let's just talk about a basic framework that I would recommend that I've seen happening in several companies. So, Thomas, very quickly. The first thing to identify would be what is the objective? What are you going to, what's going to be your anchor for a large company to align with? So although now that the scope is broadening out to nature-based objectives, until recently, so let's talk about the last 5 years, it's primarily been greenhouse gas and global warming. So let's talk then about the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees. But mainly the framework that's been built around that seems to have the most traction is SBTI. So I would recommend taking a deep investigation of aligning yourself with SBTI as the foundation. That's one way to do it. Then to look at what are the objectives going to be for your particular company or the company in question about how to meet the objective of either 2030 or 2050 for the Paris Agreement on global warming. Every company will have to have a different roadmap. A chemical company will have to focus on its largest raw materials. Maybe a consumable company or a food company has a completely different route, but that would be the second thing. How are you going to achieve those SBTI goals, because you also have to report them? The third measure, the third component of this would be, how are you going to measure that? The good news there is that there seems to be quite a bit of consolidation from the science-based community that it probably has to be grounded in life cycle assessment data. Whatever is going to be measuring today and then reporting tomorrow will have to be based on certified LCA data. And then lastly, how to prove it. And that's the supply chain transparency, the transactional details, where the real technology comes into play. And I think that's a great way to kind of summarize it and kick it back over to Juan Miguel and Geoffrey. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So yeah, we are, again, we're going to have to close. I think it's been a really interesting session and a lot of interesting insights. Once more, thank you, Geoffrey and John, for your time and for your interventions. Before we let you go, let's say, we're gonna do the raffle of Geoffrey's Carbon Capital and the Cloud book. So I'm gonna ask our team to put up that name roulette that we've got ready, and then we're gonna see who's the lucky winner. All right, so congratulations to Morgan. We'll reach out to you to sort out the logistics on the book. But again, once more, thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, John. Thanks everyone who connected. It's been a really interesting session. If you want to learn more about some of these initiatives, about what we do at Finboot, feel free to reach out through our website or through our team. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.